It's great to see everyone here joining us today to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the American intelligence community, both the past, present, and future. It's been a real honor to have an opportunity to work on this project over these past months. I'd like to thank and acknowledge my colleague and our colleague, Lindsay Thames, for helping us unpack this report, which, by the way, is now available on the Belfer Center website. I believe it will be posted, linked within the Zoom webinar here, but if you go to the Belfer Center website, you should be able to find it. But we could also not have done this report without steadfast encouragement from our team at the Intelligence Project. We really appreciate their efforts, and our HKS student researchers who contributed a lot to our understanding of this mission and also believe in the work that we're trying to do. And I'd also like to thank our panelists who are here today to help us unpack these dynamics and think about how maybe we can shape the future and learn from the past. Our panelists today are all experienced professionals that have lived much of the history we are unpacking. In the interest of time, I'm going to direct you to the event webpage for their complete bios, but a little bit about each of them to start. Natalie Colbert is the Belfer Center's Executive Director. Before coming to the center, she served in the Central Intelligence Agency for 13 years. Jeff Fields is a non-resident fellow at the Intelligence Project. He currently serves as an assistant special agent in charge, where he leads the counterintelligence branch for the FBI in San Francisco. Lori Rule has served in multiple corporate leadership roles in the CIA, including as Chief Talent Development, Executive Lead for implementation of a 2013 CIA study on women in leadership, and Director of CIA University's Intelligence Language Institute. Kristen Wood is a non-resident fellow at the Intelligence Project. She spent 20 years at the CIA, serving in the director's area and 3 agency directorates: analysis, operations, and digital innovation, and leading a wide variety of the agency missions. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Our paper and findings on diversity, equity, and inclusion in the American intelligence community is by no means a silver bullet for addressing all of the challenges we have seen on matters of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What was the purpose of this paper? Why are we doing this? Well, we seek to offer what we think of as a differential diagnosis, a perspective from outside Washington that contributes to our understanding where we have been, so we know where we are. Otherwise, it will be impossible to get to where we must be. We made our best effort to study publicly known diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives over this past 70 plus years. This does not suggest everything has been done or is ongoing, or nothing is ongoing in the community on these issues, but the vast majority of what is known in the open source. We identify common historical challenges seen time and again, and offer ideas for the way forward to solve what we think of as a cyclical and persistent challenge. For decades, the leadership of the CIA and later the Office of the Director of National Intelligence have identified diversity as a priority. To be clear, change has occurred, but slowly, incompletely, and with setbacks. Start and stop efforts have led to fleeting moments of progress and subsequent reversals. It hasn't always been smooth sailing despite the best of intentions. President Biden's 2021 order emphasizing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility as a national security imperative appear designed to reverse the previous administration. This is not the only example of differences in views between presidential administrations throughout history. But nevertheless, over the last decade, there has been progress on recognizing diversity as a critical mission imperative. Successful implementation has remained elusive, but we've also seen bright spots of optimism and potentially good trend lines in the last several years. What did we unpack in our report in history, and how are we thinking about this? We structured it within 3 different eras, all of which share common challenges, the Cold War, or really what often is thought of as the origins of organized American intelligence within government, meaning the bureaucracy and certainly the founding of the CIA. The post-Cold War era, the 1990s, so the end of the Cold War and what happened in the aftermath, and then post 9/11. All three eras shared similar challenges and obstacles that occurred in each respective decades. And they all reflected a shifting security environment with changing requirements and priorities. Leaders pursued initiatives to remedy shortcomings, but with varying results. Unfortunately, too often, leaders relearned lessons of preceding eras before recognizing diversity must play an increasing role in the function of American intelligence. And indeed, throughout much of the history, the challenges seen in the intelligence community workforce mirrored the challenges facing wider American society. But fundamentally, what are we trying to do today as a starting point in a continuing conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the American intelligence community? We're trying to learn from the past to understand the present and plan for the future. We write with high confidence in the report that a diverse IC workforce provides the US with a mission advantage. And we'll hear some examples and backgrounds on these very particular issues in the coming hour. But operations and assessments that draw upon different views, backgrounds, languages, and cultures improve outcomes and reflect modern intelligence requirements. More recently, President Biden's senior leadership team has recognized and prioritized diversity as a mission imperative. Sustainable progress requires a consistent whole of IC approach and beyond. And fundamentally, we believe that to operate in the world as it is, the workforce must reflect the realities of today and tomorrow. So I'd like to take an opportunity now to go around the table for opening comments and thoughts from our exceptional panelists joining us today. And we'll start with Natalie.
Great, thank you, Michael, and the Intel Project for the invitation and for congratulations on publishing this report, which, having had an opportunity to read through it, I think highlights, as you mentioned, a lot of the challenges that the IC has faced over the last decades, but also highlights the work that's still ongoing to make those improvements, and where other fellow members of this panel have played a role in helping to shape that work. So happy to be here and share some of my experiences as they are relevant. I think I'll just make a couple of kind of broad comments, at least in terms of where my view and my experience on why it matters has come into play when I reflect back on my time in the IC and where I saw that making a difference in terms of where we focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So as a former intelligence officer, I spent all of my time as an analyst. And so for me, where I saw the mission imperative was on the analytic mission primarily. That was my job. And I think here, when you talk in the last slide actually about the importance of diversity of background, experience, linguistics, cultural understanding, that's really where I think that played a role in our ability to be more effective as analysts and in understanding and making sense of the world and the threats that we were managing. And I can, get into more details later as the conversation evolves, but I think there are two sort of benefits here, both tactical and meta. In terms of tactical, if you're working on a specific team, looking at a specific target or say an adversary in the context of the US national security priorities, having colleagues who had a personal understanding of the history, of the politics, of the linguistic nuances of that region made our analysis that much more nuanced and made our ability to inform policymaker options more specific or relevant, as opposed to just having kind of a US-centric only view. On a meta level, I think it also helps to, over time, shift the lens, certainly within the analytic cadre, how we approach dynamics, how we view other threat actors or other what we would consider adversaries from the US perspective. What I mean by that is, say, we view Iran as an adversary. It's not the whole country of Iran. It's not all Iranian people everywhere. It's in this case, let's say the regime. And I think having colleagues who come from those backgrounds or who can reflect on that personal level, I think changes the way you are as a colleague and how you view and relate to those issues, and how you come to make a more specific view of who actually is your adversary and what are the opportunities there, as opposed to blanket statements and blanket views about whole communities, cultures, or regions. Beyond the analytic mission, the only other two things I would highlight in big terms is on personnel management. So I was also an analytic manager, and the two areas I would highlight there are retention and inclusion as a goal to maximizing use of your talent. So on retention, and I can get into this later too as we get into the discussion, I think early on in my time there, I underestimated the importance of any officer being able to, quote, see themselves in the myriad roles and opportunities that are available in the IC. But that became clearer to me, especially as I came into management, how important it is for people to be able to see and identify other people in whatever lens, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity or linguistic, whatever piece of their identity they felt was important to understanding the pathway that they could make. That is really important, I think, as a tool of retention. And then finally, on the inclusivity piece, this is literally just on how we build an inclusive culture and environment. And that is key to maximizing use of talent. So as a team manager, right, if you have 10 people, and say you're more aware of things like neurodiversity, how that affects a person's work environment, or other aspects of their identity, introverts, et cetera, it literally allows you to go from using 5 out of 10 of your people to their maximum capability to 10 out of 10 once you have a better appreciation and understanding for the diversity that they bring to work and how that helps, how you can be a better manager in leveraging their talents and skills. So I'll leave it there, but those are kind of the 3 ways that I really see this impacting day to day in the mission.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much, Natalie. Kristen, over to you. I think mute.
It would not be a Zoom call without one of those, so hopefully I'm the only one. Thank you so much. So I'll just keep my remarks brief at this section, but I think as your paper notes really, it's vital, this focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not just language, and it's not just political rubric, but it really is the fabric of how we are going to win in the war for the future, in the battle for the future, to define ourselves, to protect our own country. And I think one of the things that I've noticed is over 30 years of being involved in the national security space, in analysis, operations, open source, in a variety of different positions, is that we are ourselves becoming more diverse as a nation. And so over that time, we have brought in people from many other nations. What it used to be that if someone was gay or lesbian, they absolutely could not talk about that. And I think of over the last 30 years, the openness with which those kinds of conversations are now able to happen across racial lines, across gender lines, across sexuality, across various ethnic groups. And all of that makes our nation richer dialogue, richer understanding of one another. And it's not to say that it's perfect, but I think mirroring some of the challenges we've seen publicly across private sector, across academic institutions, across our neighborhoods and communities, the intelligence community has faced those kinds of challenges as well. And it's an insular organization, right? And in most cases, to be a part of the intelligence community, you have to have a security clearance, and you need to work in an environment where you walk into a building and you have to be cleared into the building, and you're isolated. You're not isolated. You're in a group like yourselves. And so that also has taken place in a little bit of different pace, maybe a little slower in some places, not perfect, But I think there's widespread recognition among the leadership team, both at the DNI level and the director of CIA level, Lloyd Austin across the IC, that this is a vital imperative. And the programs and opportunities that are being put in place for that to happen are really key. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But I think something that Natalie was saying earlier is more perspectives, the better. And you know, in the olden days, it used to be that I'll pick the analysis side of the house, that the political analysts thought they were the smartest. Some political analysts thought they were smartest, and the military analysts didn't really know much because they just focused on the military. And the economic analysts, well, they were different too. And well, forget the terrorism analysts, right? And so it's only when you get all those people in a room where you can see a bigger perspective. Now you add in people with different experiences where they grew up, different language backgrounds, different identities in a variety of different ways, and you're only enriching the dialogue. So I think it's a mirror of what we're seeing in society. It's not perfect, but I think everyone who is in that community now knows that and is working on developing it and moving it forward. So I look forward to continue the conversation, and I'm just really glad to have the opportunity to do this. And thank you so much for tackling this issue today.
Thank you so much, Chris, and really appreciate your insight on this. Jeff, we'll turn to you next for opening comments.
Thank you, Michael. I would just like to say, you know, I think and I believe your paper kind of highlights what one of the conclusions that I've come to is that, you know, good intentions aren't enough, right? It's not like there's this secret society of Protestant white men who have been deliberately trying to keep other folks out. There have been some well-intentioned efforts, but I think, as we all know, right, especially in our culture, in the intelligence community, culture will always bend policy, will always bend regulations, will always bend law, even values to its will, right? But culture isn't like this. Like sometimes I feel like, especially in the last 20 years of the counterterrorism effort, is, you know, we feel like we treat culture as this immutable reality that we have no power to change, and that's BS, right? Like, people create culture individually, right? Like we have the power to say, hey, these are the values we want to espouse and to perpetuate, and we have the ability to create a culture that, together with policy and you know, new generation of folks who have a different perspective, to really have long-standing change. And, you know, even if you are not a true believer, and even if you don't do it because it's the right thing to do, even just from a strategic, you know, Sun Tzu point of view, Xi Jinping, right, Putin, you know, Kim Jong-un, they can't go to the West Indian neighborhood in Brooklyn to recruit. They can't go to the Korean neighborhood in Seattle and recruit. They can't go to the Hill Country of West Virginia, to the Bayou in New Orleans, or to a Native American reservation in Montana. That is like our key strategic advantage over our adversaries. Our technology and our money alone is not going to secure success and victory when it comes to within the national security realm. Our ability to identify, to connect, to recruit, elevate, and retain that talent from America is our key strategic advantage over our adversaries. And I don't understand why, even for the people who don't just feel comfortable with people like me being in their midst, why they wouldn't, even just to, you know, for the purpose of, you know, America, you know, maintaining or being able to have, you know, our military superiority and whatnot, would see that, right? It seems like almost like the logical conclusion. So like I forget the individual said it, but, you know, it's diversity is not a nice to have, it's a need to have. I think tactically we get it. For those of us who have been operating around the world, we get it, right? Because there's just some regions in the world where if you don't have someone who has that cultural familiarity, language skills, you just aren't going to be able to operate. But I think in my experience, within the last 20 years, I have seen that on the tactical side, especially in the counterterrorism realm, where you do have teams of integrated with women and different gender identities and cultural backgrounds, there's like a point where as you get into senior leadership, it becomes like really homogenous. And so I think when I talk about good intentions aren't enough, it's incumbent upon the leadership to say, okay, it's been 10 years. Why is it that every time we sit down at this table, everyone looks alike? And it's that constant reassessment to say, are we doing enough to reach people where they are? Because I think a lot of times we want to take the easy way out, and we're creating an initiative that targets the LGBTQ plus community, or that targets the Black community. And by that, I mean, they'll go to HBCUs. Well, only 20% of Black people in America go to HBCUs. So you're not even touching 80% of the folks, right? So that's kind of like, we kind of get lazy and not appreciate that every American has a distinctly unique experience, right? And we have to do the work to meet those people, the younger generation, to meet them where they are at eye level, to communicate with them in the means that they communicate, on the platforms that they consume the media on, right? And not take the easy way out and go out to the communities, go out to these neighborhoods, go out to these regions of the country and say, hey, we want to create a space, even if we don't have it now, we want you to help us create a space for you, for people who think like you and live like you within the intelligence community. And I'll leave it at that, because I know there's a lot of really good stuff we're probably gonna get into over the course of the next hour and a half. But those are just two key things, in terms of culture, and good intentions is not enough. It's got to be more deliberate.
Fantastic, Jeff. Thank you very much. Lori.
Yes, so thank you for the opportunity to serve on the panel, and congratulations again on the paper. And yes, Natalie, yes, Kristen, yes, Jeff, you all have made such excellent points, and I agree 100%. I will just add a few things that hopefully build on that. As I was reflecting a little bit of why it matters myself, at the end of the day, intelligence work is all about human beings and relationships. And it doesn't matter what int you're in. And it's about understanding the mindset of our adversaries. And, we're trying to understand Putin's mindset today with the whole Ukraine situation, for example. And it's all about interacting, collaborating, cooperating with our allies as well. So in order to do that, again, like Jeff, I don't know why people would not want to pull on diversity of thought, background, experience that is so rich here in America to help set us up for success, to be able to tackle what I would say are truly, at least since I started 30 some years ago at the agency, increasingly complex and interconnected intelligence challenges. We often say people are our greatest asset, so let's live that. And then the second thing I would say is, it's hard to visualize those sometimes. I think that's part of the challenge, right? All of you mentioned language and culture near and dear to my heart. And that's kind of a no-brainer. We get that. You have to understand, the country that you're serving in. You have to maybe speak the language or what have you. It's sometimes harder to visualize where some elements of diversity, and Natalie, you mentioned meta, and that made me think a little bit. It's that sort of more nuanced underlying. For example, I had an aha moment once. I was listening to a presentation by a woman with a disability. She was unable to walk, and she was talking about her experiences, her life experiences have enabled her to be a better problem solver, because she always has to plan, think ahead. How is she going to navigate literally through a situation? And she's more creative in thinking about how to do that than maybe somebody who just takes it for granted that they can walk across the street. So to me, it's kind of a no-brainer that why wouldn't we want to both incorporate more diversity, be inclusive and optimize that talent, and make sure that we all have a level playing field then with access to opportunity, diversity, inclusion, and I love the addition of equity. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Lori, and thanks to all of our panelists for just a phenomenal round of opening comments. And I'm trying to contain my excitement here and stay on track, but it's just such an amazing array of comments that I think do speak to what it is we're trying to unpack here. And I really appreciate that. And we'll definitely return to some of the themes in further discussion. So I do want to turn now, Lindsay and I are going to walk through some of our key findings and takeaways from our report. And one of the, I think, pieces of good news in a way is that we've seen throughout history, or rather over the course of history, that diversity, as Jeff talked about, and Kristen and Natalie and Lori, the idea of it being a mission imperative has very much picked up solid ground and is now, without a doubt, central in the minds of key leaders in the community. And we see this in some of the comments going back to the post-Cold War, even late Cold War, we saw some of this, but a lot more certainly, starting with Director George Tenet, talked about the need for demographic diversity to really penetrate our toughest targets around the world, as Jeff talked about a little bit. And then Mike Hayden, who was Director of Central Intelligence Agency in 2006, also acknowledged that, to Lori's superb points that she just talked about, is that you do need these capabilities and functions in your workforce. And when you don't have that, you often run into problems, and indeed it can result in impact a failure of intelligence to provide things like strategic warning. And what I think was critical about Hayden's point here, and this has picked up more and more as we move forward, is that the US needs to leverage its greatest asset, as Jeff talked about, its people. The United States is a unique, some call it an experiment, but it's certainly in many ways a melting pot of so many cultures, backgrounds, experiences, and people from everywhere. And that's not the case for some of our toughest competitors necessarily. So since 2007, diversity has been a strategic mission imperative. So just to understand some of the strategic approaches by key parts of the IC, the ODNI has looked at it as a strategic mission imperative since at least 2007. In 2009, ICD 110, that's an intelligence community directive, promoted diversity in the IC as a mission critical imperative. Recruitment, development, retention of minorities, women, persons with disabilities, individuals of various backgrounds, cultures, generations, perspectives, and ideas, among others. So you see this now codified within sort of the execution and day-to-day of the IC. It captured the necessity of diversity, and it was a commitment to accountability through the development and implementation of performance measures. That isn't to suggest this has always been successful to this point. We think there are some areas that need some further thought and study, but to be sure, in the long history of this, it does suggest there has been progress in the post sort of Cold War, post 9/11 world. In 2019, the National Intelligence Strategy emphasized building a diverse workforce and instructed the IC to forge and retain just such a workforce. So you see this within the National Intelligence Strategy. In 2020, you see the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, or as many call it, HPSI, reiterate that diversity and inclusion is a mission critical priority. So not only are you seeing this from the White House and leaders within the IC, you're also seeing this from Congress. So codifying this as a priority central to the mission is a significant milestone that is, in many respects, very different from that Cold War and immediate post-Cold War era. And indeed, last March, DNI Haynes emphasized we must also identify policies and practices that disadvantaged and underserved communities experience, and we must ensure equity considerations are applied, stressing accountability and that this is a mission imperative within the IC. And importantly, data-driven approaches can help us with accountability, oversight, and ensure that we are executing this priority in the IC. So I'd like to turn the floor over now to Lindsay, who's going to walk us through sort of a brief history of IC DEI initiatives that we found in our research. I think it's worth noting it's not necessarily everything that has ever been done, but certainly publicly known and we've been made aware of in the past 70 plus years. So Lindsay, over to you, and you let me know when you want me to move forward.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. And first and foremost, I just want to say that it's important to recognize that the IC has really been on the same diversity journey as much of American society. And so what we really sought in this project was to find what was unique about the IC and what were the areas that maybe we could improve upon in general. Next slide, please. So the first era that we kind of broke down to look at this was really from the inception of the CIA until the late 1980s. And so when we look at the Cold War era, we noticed that, you know, the CIA historically recruited from a very narrow group of people. It was very elite. And we saw mostly a recruitment from the Ivy Leagues and Wall Street, promoting kind of a very homogenous community. This generally excluded women and minorities. And well, though there were women at the agency. So the first report that we found of significance was in 1953, which was actually directed by then Director of Central Intelligence, Alan Dulles. And it was called the Petticoat Panel. And I will say the one really interesting thing about this report is that it actually remains classified today. And you'll hear this kind of throughout as this idea of transparency and the challenge specifically for the IC of balancing security and transparency when dealing with this diversity challenge, specifically with personnel demographics. So it was in 2013 that the CIA released a report that detailed much of this original report. It provided a lot of insight into what happened at this time. Next slide, please. It's also important to recognize that this was the first example of internal pressure from within. The report was actually commissioned because senior women at the organization lobbied for this to be done, and were actually the members on the panel. But ultimately, once the panel was presented to the board of all men, actually, little really was done at this time to implement the suggestions. It was not seen as a mission imperative. Diversity was seen as a challenge, but it was really more seen as this was a potential discrimination act towards women, and the director wanted to get to the bottom of it. We really saw like a lack of buy-in from mid and senior level managers, but really at this time, it's also important to recognize kind of the period of where we were in history. As I say, this was really symbolic of kind of the thinking of where we were going in the 50s and 60s. So it wasn't really until the 60s and 70s when EEO legislation came out requiring changes to be made. And there was an interesting commentary in the mid 1970s where there was recognition of and actually implementation of some of the previous recommendations. And again, this recognition that diversity may be important, but there was really no traction in pushing this forward as a mission imperative. Next slide, please. So the next era that we looked at was really from the late 1980s to 9/11. And this started out when it was actually the first and I believe the only African-American chair of any intelligence committee, which is Congressman Louis Stokes, started to bring up this idea of diversity as an operational necessity. And so this came up now in Congress for the first time in the late 1980s. Simultaneously, there were several big moving kind of situations, reports, and things going on. We also started to see the media get involved. So there was a CIA, class action lawsuit against women, against the agency for discrimination. And there was also a significant media presence against the NSA, talking about minorities, the lack of minority hiring at NSA. During this time, there was a report produced by the CIA that was briefed to Congress, and basically resulted in the fact that, look, we identified that there are glass ceilings for women and minorities and people of different ethnic groups, that women were concentrated and minorities were concentrated at lower grades, promotion rates were a challenge. Next slide. So once the lawsuit was settled, the CIA lawsuit, CIA was required to provide back pay and salary increases to some women, retroactive promotions and transfers back to operational roles. There was now a significant leadership buy-in that they vowed to promote and support people fairly. And at the same time, we saw diversity hearings every year from 1993 to 1996 addressing this challenge. So now we started to see internal pressure and external pressure, both from Congress and from media at large. I'd also like to, talk about this last point here, which was that many retired CIA officers described this as a really significant turning point, as bringing this really to surface and provided some really provided some teeth to the issues that people were bringing up internally. And next slide, please. And lastly, we see 9/11 to the present day, and this was a significant turning point. now we knew that, you know, diversity was mission imperative, as you saw previously when Michael was talking, that there was policy and directive after the other addressing, you know, diversity is now a mission imperative. We need diversity for mission necessity. This was really important. But what we also saw was significant hiring, and we saw this increase in personnel to fight the global war on terror, as well as wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. There was also significant kind of changes to the IC in that there were deployments and kind of more of this militarized culture, significant hiring of contractors. And specifically what we learned from interviews was this actually played a significant, was a really significant cost for women specifically, who essentially were in the position that if you wanted to promote, you had to deploy, and therefore it was a strain on people with families in general. This was also when Congress started to take a look again at what was going on in the 90s and what kind of legislation needed to be passed. Next slide, please. So now we saw, again, increasing pressure from Congress. We saw legislation passed that required the IC to report demographic information on diversity in the IC. Interestingly enough, this was required in 2005. And these reports were not published publicly until 2017, excuse me. So there was a long gap here of kind of the transparency of what was going on internally. We also saw in 2003 that it was reported still that women and minorities were still significantly represented in a lower percentage than both the civilian labor force and the rest of the federal government. So they're underrepresented most specifically in senior grades and core mission areas. This actually was something that we saw again in 2015, and specifically then Director Brennan, who commissioned a study, they found in this study that this was the same challenge that they saw. And in many aspects, they said there was almost a reversal from 20 years past, specifically on the promotion and retention rates of diversity in the senior ranks. And, you know, I'm actually, if you go to the next slide, please. Many of our panelists have kind of experienced these reports, and I'll be honest, there were report after report after report from 2011 to present, and there's been so many changes and so much stress on this being a mission imperative that it's actually it's hard to keep up with. But we did find that over and over again, we seem to see the same trend and commentary that there is significant leadership buy-in. And then there is this challenge with culture change. There's a challenge with transparency and accountability, and mid and senior level buy-in to implementing this change. And then I'll say one really interesting report that came out most recently was by GAO, and this looked at kind of how the community was implementing diversity and inclusion initiatives. And they still identified that there was really additional oversight needed and accountability needed in this specific area. I think that's the next one, please. One additional area that we recognized throughout our research, and this really stems again really from 9/11 to present, was the fact that contractors are not counted for in diversity reporting and diversity reporting metrics. And this is not surprising because it's not required by law, frankly. But we do know that the amount of contractors that have been hired and that work, you know, hand in hand with other people in the intelligence community was originally in 27% in 2007, and potentially even up to 50%, we believe, at some times. So now that number is falling, but we think this is a huge kind of gap in terms of recent reporting and metrics, because this is a huge part of the community that has not been previously accounted for. Next slide. So we believe that nobody is really looking at these numbers because it's not required, but we do think that it is incredibly important and relevant when looking at the culture and the community that exists in the IC. As I previously said, another reports and people that we spoke with believe that this is considered in the reporting. Next slide. All right, and back to you, Michael.
Lindsay, thank you so much. Clearly, there's a lot we can learn from past efforts, and that's something we've tried to do here. Common challenges and tread lines across all different eras of history. And I want to just take a minute and highlight a few common themes before we turn to our panel to hear from their experience and observations in this space. So one big theme that we've seen, certainly since the Petticoat Panel of 1953, is that the community has struggled with insufficient transparency and metrics on matters of diversity and inclusion. Admittedly, this is a hard space to do if you think about the history and the nature of intelligence work. There's been challenges with accountability in both public sector employees, but also contractors doing the work of the American people. Transforming diversity policy into action has been consistently inconsistent. And we see a lot of structural challenges and bureaucracy as part of the reason. So differences between administrations, policy priorities, changing security environments. There's been moments of success, to be sure, but often, perhaps too often, it's been disregarded in favor of metrics that reinforce the status quo. Contradictory policymaker direction and oversight has led to a lack of accountability. And this is something that we heard from D&I Haynes last year, and it's a theme and something that we've heard in report after report after report, as Lindsay talked about, both from Congress, but also from the IC itself, and often outside think tanks or universities. Differences between the branches of government, broken relationships between the White House and the community, all of this plays a role, to be sure. So I'd like now to take another few minutes here to go around the table and just to hear from the experience and observations of our panelists on not necessarily exactly what we talked about, but any other observations and thoughts they have on these issues. And we'll start with Natalie.
Always have to find my unmute button. All right, so in kind of thinking ahead towards this panel, I was trying to think about this question of sort of my experience and how it evolved over time with diversity, equity, inclusion, both as a cultural experience, but then also my role in shaping that as I kind of evolved in my career. So I have just a couple of thoughts, and I'll try to share some examples. So the first kind of takeaway that I had is, which I think is probably true for many people, is that my awareness and contribution to making the culture at the agency more inclusive evolved, right? So as a junior officer, you're not engaging in a lot of those activities as much, or you don't know what's out there, what's going on. And over time, you get a better sense of how your colleagues are interacting with this work, and then you're also volunteering and helping. And I think the main takeaway from that is actually there is a lot you can do right away. And I think my understanding of that evolved as I became a manager, and especially as the conversation shifted in my time between 2008 and 2021 in terms of the emphasis on this work and how everyone at every level could really contribute. So that, I think, evolved in my time there. And so I'll give you kind of like an anecdotal kind of example of how my own personal perspective changed. So one of these studies that was mentioned was a study on women in leadership. I think it kicked off in 2013. So I was sort of a mid-level analyst at that time, and they ran a series of focus groups with different grade levels. And I participated in one of those focus groups. And it involved including like advisory board of external experts who were part of that review. And one of those people happened to be Madeleine Albright at the time. And she was part of this panel, and I was participating in this group. And the question I got was, you know, how important is it to you as a junior female analyst to see women in some of these leadership roles? And so, of course, on the surface at that time, the answer is yes, it's really important, and I appreciate and value all of the effort and what it took, right, in the decades that preceded my time at the agency for these women to reach those levels, understanding that history. But at the same time, for me, what was more important was the leader's quality and their traits. And so for me personally, it was less important that they were women per se, and more important just who was inspiring as a leader. And I gave that answer to them. And I think this is relevant because if you fast forward then to, what was it, 2020, when Gina Haspel is appointed as the first female director of, or excuse me, earlier when the Trump administration came in, she's appointed as the first female director. The anecdote I have for that is I was walking down the hall in the main building of the agency. If you've ever been there, there's a wall of portraits. So every time there's a new director, they paint a portrait, and they're there historically in chronological order. Of course, they are all white men in a line going back decades. You pass this every day, you go get your lunch. It's something just kind of in the background periphery. But for whatever reason, there was one day after she was appointed that it suddenly occurred to me as I was walking past this wall that someday there is going to be a portrait of her. And the reality was, going back to my initial experience, for me personally, directors like Brennan and Panetta had more of an engaging role in my experience. I had more engagement with them than I ever had with Gina Haspel. So as a director, I felt more connected to some of these male directors than I did to her. But the fact that there was a woman in that position, it hit me at that moment how important it was for me personally that that was possible, and that it had happened, and that that meant something to other people, including myself. And I think what else that sort of, I guess, illuminated in a personal way for me, I reflected back on a related but separate experience that I had. So this was kind of a female gender identity example. But throughout my career working at different levels, whenever I would have colleagues who were Black, the reality is there are fewer, as we said, the minority representation is fewer. And so very often, if you had a minority colleague, they were like the only person on the team, right? There was one, maybe two. And that was also reflected at senior levels, as has been discussed, right? I mean, I can count on two hands, going through this time, how many senior leaders who were Black were at the agency as compared to everybody else. And I remember talking with some colleagues who were my level, so junior level, and both of whom are Black, and they said, it's tough. I don't see other people who can share my experience. I don't feel like there's a pathway where people have my experiences that I can see, that I can relate to. And this was exactly kind of what I was saying, right? Like on the female study, I want to see people who I can relate to, but also who inspire me. And it was, again, at this moment when I saw this, when I had this recognition that there would be this female portrait, I could at least relate to some of what my colleagues might have experienced before, which is they need to be able to see examples of success that resonate with them. It's important for them to understand how a pathway could look for themselves, and that this agency values their experience and their contribution, and they can see a way to stay here. Because at the time when I was interacting with colleagues, that was a reason for them not to stay, right? They were thinking and looking around and saying, is this really the right place for me? And so I think that kind of highlighted for me, again, this importance on diversity as not just a mission imperative, which it is, but this idea that you need to reflect the community you're from is important, because people need to feel like they can have a way forward and a career path that is viable, that seems real. So that's kind of one anecdote. In terms of other things that I noticed that changed over my time, a lot of what was reflected in this study demonstrates that kind of post even the 2006, 2007 timeframe, which is right around the time when I entered the agency, there were a lot more momentum in studies and comments and commitments from senior leadership on the importance of diversity. And I think that was borne out for me too, in terms of the shifting environment and the creation of more space to talk about these issues, even just in the last 2 years. So like everywhere else in America, the murder of George Floyd and the protests that erupted after that were galvanizing, at least from my perspective, in terms of both top down and bottom up demand for conversation around this and what it meant for our community and how we could be more diverse, not just be more diverse, but to talk about these issues and be more inclusive. And that, I think, was a huge moment that really shifted, as it did kind of across the country, in terms of bringing more space to talk about these issues and more ideas, more people being interested in doing this work within the agency. And I think just the last point I'll make is, so again, my takeaway is that I felt like there was positive momentum, at least at the point at which I was leaving. But, there is still this split between people who perceive, that are we trying to get to diversity for diversity's sake, or is it this mission imperative? I think there is still a bit of that dynamic. But again, I think progress is being made. And although it's not necessarily ubiquitous mindset yet, I do think there's been a lot of shift at the senior levels of that. And I had that experience working in my last role for senior leaders who really valued the need for this conversation and action steps that they wanted to take to promote what they could change within their department, within their center. And so that, I think, was a very positive kind of outcome of creating more space and more people being willing and interested in being part of this work.
Well, thank you, Natalie. That's just such a powerful story. Thinking about the portraits, that is not something that I had considered or really thought about, but the effect and the impact of walking down the hallway and seeing that now after generations of change is remarkable.
Can I just add a comment on portraits real quick too? Because
please, yeah.
It's not just the wall of directors, but just about every conference room of a main office, you see all the previous directors. And yes, there's a lot of homogenous looking faces there, I would say. So that's only lately beginning to change. That's a real visible sign of the type of diversity or lack thereof that you see.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Lori. Kristen, over to you. And I know I see a hand from a familiar face we'll go to in a minute, but go ahead, Kristen.
Oh, good. Thanks so much, Michael. So I want to focus a little bit on what's changed. So having the perspective of about 30 years, and I think that's important because, you know, I look at it from what's changed over all that time, where we need to go. And that's not to say, I mean, to Jeff's point, to me, and Lori's point, absolutely, we should be there. And then I think about how far we've come over time. And I want to make sure to note those points too. So, you know, I think, you know, first of all, when I started in the late 80s, there weren't very many women there at all in the part of the organization I was in. In fact, so much so that I came in on a Monday and my mentor was mad at me first when I started. And I thought, well, okay, I haven't been here long enough to have done anything yet. So kind of what is happening? And he said, well, you guys are ruining things. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, you women. I said, well, you know, I've been here for an hour and a half now, so I'm not really sure what you mean. And he said, well, you know, this was a more, you know, traditional military part of the organization. And they said, well, we had to take down all the posters of women that we had posted everywhere. And because they said you would object. And I just looked at him and he said, you wouldn't object, would you? And I said, yeah, actually, I kind of would have. So, you know, it's just that of a mindset of someone who at that time had been working for 20 years, and that was the way that it was. And so, you know, many more women there now across the organization. I don't know what the balance is, but pretty even. And I think about what has changed because I was recently involved in an event that featured Virginia Hall. So for those of you who don't know, she's an Office of Strategic Services, so the predecessor to CIA, just a legend. She is the only woman to receive the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions in World War II. So behind enemy lines in Europe, running networks, setting up operations to close off bridges and tunnels and to stop the German resupply to allow allies to invade. And what her work did, what it was remarkable. And when CIA was established, she went to the follow-on organization and was just this dynamite woman who had done everything overseas on a wooden leg. She was trying to escape the Germans because they were after her. Finally, she had to leave, and she crossed the Alps on a wooden leg in the winter. I mean, just think about that, right? And so she comes to sit at headquarters, and they're not really sure what to do with her. And her first performance review is by a manager who's not her manager. And he says, well, I'm not really that impressed with her. She hasn't, you know, done this, that, and the other, and she doesn't wear makeup. And Virginia Hall, being no shrinking violet, called the president of the United States of America, with whom she was very familiar, and said, I don't think this is fair. And he called the director of CIA and said, perhaps you would like someone to review her performance who actually saw it versus someone from a distance. And she got a better review. But I think it just was a sign of she was out of the box creating magic for our country. And all of a sudden, because she was a woman, she was expected to be in this little box. And I think about the hidden figures and the story that we've all read the book, right? There wasn't even a restroom that Black women could use in the same building. And then I think about the case officers, the very first case officers. Lori, you know, 10 years, 15 years before we came in, there weren't any women And they had to fight really, really hard to do that because they didn't think women could do the job. And the generation before us really had to dress like men. I mean, it's this banking suit with the big shoulders. I mean, everyone remembers the 80s. Well, maybe you don't, but I do. And these men look because you did not want to call attention to the fact you weren't a man. And so I think about how that has changed now. And I think a big part of it is more women as part of the organization. There's a much more diverse workforce, much more needed to be done. Mid-career hires, though, are another element of diversity. People who had been in professions for 10, 15 years elsewhere who came to help. And in fact, so much so, if you think about before 9/11, they created something called the Red Cell, which was a group of people who we were so concerned about groupthink and missing things. It was the group of original thinkers who sometimes had been a little ridiculed in their parts of the organization, were brought together to think creatively. And I think that was a huge element of diversity as well. So the millennials also, I think, are bringing much to the mission as well with their different perspective. And I just know, one of the questions you asked before was, did it matter when we saw things differently? And I think of a couple things. When I was there in the early 90s, I created something called the NPIC, National Photographic Interpretation Center Women's Development Group, because we didn't really know how to be professionals and we didn't have a lot of help. And so we brought in senior women to talk to us about, managing and taking risks, about how to succeed in interviews and all of these things like this. And in the course of the conversation, what I discovered was the experience of Black women, and at the time it wasn't women of color, it was white women and Black women. That's obviously evolved and enriched as well since then. They were saying, if you think you have it bad, we have two barriers. Not only are we women, but we're women of color. And what they described their experience was I had frustrations about, maybe not being considered positions. They had to fight to be considered not to be secretaries, right? And so I think that gap between white men and women and people of color has maintained. All of us have done better, but I don't think the gap has changed much. And I think that's something we definitely have to fix. So, I'll stop there just to say that's where we've come from. And the people in leadership now who've been there for 30 years, that's what they've witnessed. So not being as close to the cutting edge as folks on the outside are, I think that imperative that's driven by the Biden administration, by Director Haynes, by Director Burns is going to be vital. But that's a bit where they're coming from. And I'm really interested to hear Lori's perspective as one of the leaders of the directors advisory group led by Madeleine Albright, who we recently just lost. But that was done in April 2012, so 9 years ago. And it talked about a lot of the gaps between men and women at the time. And Lori was one of the seminal figures in executing that. So I'd love to hear what she has to say as part of your dialogue. Lori, sorry to tee you up for something, but just thank you for the opportunity to talk about that.
Well, thank you, Kristen. That's just an incredible story, and especially on Virginia Hall, just an incredible American history there. But I am, just before we go to our next two panelists, I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative here, and I see what's called a two-finger in the audience, and a familiar face and a good friend to the project. Director Clapper, it's good to see you, sir. I can hear you.
Thanks. Can you see me, hear me?
We can hear you. We can't see you.
I don't think I can do anything about that. That's okay. I'm ugly anyway. This has been a great discussion. One of the best I've ever listened to. And I think that's a function of the quality of the panelists you have. I'd just like to say one comment about this, having struggled with it, this challenge as an agency director twice for almost 9 years, and again as DNI for 6.5. And I became convinced, and this is not politically correct, but I'll say it to this group. I became convinced that the only way to really make progress in righting the wrongs with adequate representation of women minorities is to disproportionately recruit. You have to bring in a larger number of those cohorts, women and minorities at the entry level, in order to ensure that you can overcome the challenges posed by the attrition that occurs for reasons, sociological reasons, I believe, that are beyond the control of the intelligence community to fix all by itself. And a little vignette, when I think it was about 2003, and I was serving as the director of what was then called NEMA, later NGA. And every year, HIPSI used to have diversity hearings. And those were kind of a challenge because they were in public. So you could count on demonstrators being there to badmouth the agency directors. I was on the receiving end of a lot of that. Some of it was probably deserved. So I stayed up the night before that hearing and rewrote my oral testimony to say just what I just said, that the only way to overcome this over time really is through disproportionate recruiting. And at literally the 11th hour, I got a call from the Office of Management Budget, since you're supposed to submit testimonies to them, telling me I couldn't say that because that smacked of quotas. So I decided, okay, I'll do it unofficially. And I tried to do that at NGA to bring in more women and more minorities by concentrating, for example, on historically Black colleges, universities for recruiting efforts. And I could do that. I could send my recruiters from NGA or NEMA where I wanted to. So we will make, the history has been, as you all know better than I, we've made very small incremental improvements each year over time. But I'm convinced that the only way we're ever going to really overcome this is through disproportionate recruiting. I'm very proud of the fact that I had a lot to do with the installation of the first woman as a major agency director, Tish Wong as director of NGA, and then Betty Sapp as director of the NRO, a first there as well, both of whom were superb, and had a lot to do with the installation of Vince Stewart as the first African-American director of one of the major intelligence agencies, all of which, by the way, long overdue. I thought those were important symbols, but actually institutionally, they really don't solve the problem. And I say this out of conviction that people mean well. Every director, issues statements, does commission studies and all that, but that doesn't change things very much. And if the community is going to, and had it been easy to solve, we'd have done it a long time ago. So anyway, I appreciate the opportunity to vent and offer my 2 cents. And it's been a great discussion. I really benefited from it. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim. It's great to hear you and really appreciate your insight and your long tenured service in U.S. government and the lessons we all continue to learn from you here at the Belfer Center. So thank you. Jeff, over to you. And then Lori, yeah.
So I would just say first, I love Lori's point, and this is something that I communicate to every student, every person I speak to who may have aspirations for joining is, what the world and particularly America has told you makes you deficient is your superpower, right? If you wear a hijab, if you speak with an accent, if you have a physical disability, how you navigate the world, that's your superpower. So lean into that. And I know for me personally on my team, that's something that I want to make sure that every single person knows is that I want to create space where you can feel free to be your full self, because I need you to bring your full self to the table when we talk about strategy, when we talk about, executing operation. I just wanted, for anyone in the audience to hear, I just wanted to second what Lori's point about like what society, what the cover of news of magazines, what Hollywood, what they tell you about your body type or whatever it is that you've been tried to, been brainwashed to believe makes you deficient. That's your superpower. No more for the women and the people of color. No code switching. No more code switching. No more hiding your accent. No more be your true self, because we need you to be your true self. That is your superpower. So I just wanted to, second what Lori said, because I truly believe that. I will say that, my experience, again, early on, many of us are idealists and we believe that we can change the world, right? And for me, it took a little bit longer for reality to sink in, because when you're doing operations, again, for me, I almost always had an integrated team, because I was operating in Africa, I was operating in the Middle East, I was operating in Eastern Europe. So I almost always had an integrated team. And it wasn't until I got into management and came back to DC where I was like, wow, there was really nobody who looks like me. I'm like, okay. And this is kind of what prompted my foray into academia, to really understand how to change, how can you change bureaucracy? How can you institute culture change? And it's almost impossible to reach a critical mass of enough good folks to overcome institutionalized, thinking and systems. And we are trying to overcome decades long, maybe even hundreds of years long, of institutionalized thinking about who should be able to serve their country in this capacity, right? So you have to change. You need good people as well. You're always going to need good people, but we need to change the system. We need to change the culture. And so I think it took me coming to DC to see that there was zero or very, very few people who look like me, or like the people who I grew up with in leadership positions, for me to appreciate that, wow, it doesn't matter how many good people doing the right thing every day, until we change the system, until we change the culture, are we gonna really see the kind of change that we want. And I think, again, to second Director Clapper's point, and I think, which is kind of what the paper highlights as well, is that good intentions aren't enough. If you think about the Civil Rights Act and Title IX, right? There was a study done a few years ago that said the three biggest, the Civil Rights Act was designed, and a lot of the things that came out of like affirmative action, some other things, whether you agree with it or not, were specifically designed to impact the descendants of slaves in America, right? The biggest benefactor from the Civil Rights Act is in America, white women. Second to that are immigrants, and third to that are African immigrants, right? Great, fantastic, right? But for those of us in this profession, we know the danger of mission creep, right? And while there were really great intentions behind what was going into the Civil Rights Act and a lot of the other things like Title IX that came out of that, no one really took time to assess. And I think the paper, highlights that there was really no system for evaluating, hey, are we having the impact that we thought we were going to have? Because if you're saying that a lot of these things were supposed to impact the descendants of slaves, and the top three groups who are benefiting from this act are not the descendants of slaves, but then, and it's very virtuous, very like things that we absolutely need, but that's not what it was originally designed to do. And so how do we ensure that we align those good intentions with a system of accountability and transparency that ensures that we have an iterative process that is honest and is inclusive, so that we can address the issue in a way that has long-standing impact. And so and one other thing I wanted to say also as well is the transparency piece. I think this is also highlighted in the paper. For those of you who've been watching, the horrible developments with Ukraine and Russia, one of the silver linings, not to at all in any way, shape, form, or fashion minimize the level of suffering that's happening in Ukraine, and within that diaspora, in Russian diaspora as well. But silver lining with regard to the intelligence profession is the incredible degree to which the administration has declassed and disseminated information to inform the public, to inform public policymakers, but also to actually have battlefield impact, to remove options for Putin as they're navigating the battlefield in Ukraine. And I think, at least from the Intel project, I think there's a consensus around the community defaults to classification way too much. And I feel like, how do we address the diversity deficiency without being transparent? It's just like, it can't work, right? The contractor vignette that you all discussed is a case and example about that, right? To that, just one anecdote for myself, and then I'll shut up. Also in the paper, and I think Kristen touched on it as well, is that the last 20 years, right, the IC was very, very paramilitary focused, right? And that has obvious limitations and barriers to entry for leadership for women, particularly in the military before combat roles were opened up to them, right? Because for you to get a star, become a 4-star, if you had to have combat command and you can't, as a woman, enter a combat role, well, then how are you ever going to become a general, a 4-star general, right? But also too, it limited, just based on a lot of the cultural realities on the ground. So for instance, there was a time when I was in Afghanistan and I was with a team in ODA with one of the special forces groups. And for those of you who aren't aware, that's usually a team of 12 to 15 guys who are outside, who are in the middle of nowhere. And in this particular case, we were attached, the 5 we were on, we were attached to a larger conventional base. We had one woman as a targeter who's a contractor who was attached to us. She was fantastic, phenomenal. For those of you who don't understand the value of intelligence, of intelligence-informed operations, if you don't get intel, if you ain't got a good analyst or a good targeter, you ain't going to get targets, right? You can't have fun. And she was integral to the success that we were having in that particular province in Afghanistan. The rate of sexual assault on that conventional base was so high that we had to set up a system where in the middle of the night, if she had to go to the bathroom, 2 guys had to accompany her to the bathroom. Now think about when you talk about pressures and stressors and things that have nothing to do with the mission, right? And now you think about the women because, right, people want to go where the action is. A lot of times promotion is based on your experience and your ability to perform and thrive in that environment. So if you're a woman back in DC or back in the United States and you're hearing that, wait, you have to do what? How many women do you think are going to be lining up to take that assignment, right? So it's the things that we don't even think about or don't even consider if we're not in that, if we don't have that perspective to say, wow, we just probably told 20,000 women that there's no place for them because in order to be combat effective, this team has to assign 2 men to escort this woman to the bathroom in the middle of the night because the rate of sexual assault on the conventional base is so high.
Thank you very much, Jeff. What a powerful illustrative example of the challenges that we tried to understand in our report about how there are so many challenges in deployment and overseas that one doesn't always think about, but nevertheless shapes the reality and is very much part of the lived experience that is insufficient and inadequate for an intelligence community in the 21st century, really any century, quite frankly. But I now want to turn to Lori, who has been teed up by Kristen, because she is, without a doubt in my mind, our MVP on this panel and has some really interesting background about working with the very late but most excellent Madeleine Albright.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I had to take some notes here because there are so many themes and words that people popped out there that I just want to make some very brief comments on, and then I will talk about the Women in Leadership report because personally, that was a defining moment in my own career, and I'll share a little bit of that. But let me just say a few things. One, I just wanted to mention in terms of transparency, And this is about both the Women in Leadership report that CI did in 2013. That's when the report was released. And the Diversity in Leadership study that was released in 2015. Those reports are out there in the public sphere, as are each year of implementation, what was done. So for anyone who's interested, just Google Google DAG Women in Leadership and CIA DLS study, and you can read all about them, which I think was an excellent move on the part of Director Brennan to make those publicly available. And that speaks to the point of transparency. On visibility, I just wanted to say this was an aha moment for me when I was working on the Women in Leadership report, because one of the things that I heard loud and clear, and particularly from minority officers, honestly, was I need to be able to kind of see myself. And, you know, Natalie, your point is a good one. This isn't just seeing yourself, but somebody who doesn't have the skill set to do the job as well, certainly. So one of the things I like to do in my spare time, I don't know, I love to look at popular movies and kind of pull out the leadership theme. So I don't know how many of you have seen My Cousin Vinny. It's out there. It was, I don't know, in the 90s or whatever, Joe Pesci. But there's a scene when he says, I went into law because my mentor, the judge, who comes from whatever it was, whatever area of the country, which was, you know, somewhat backwater, or people didn't always have a lot of education, because he became a judge. And I thought to myself, if he can do it, I can too. And that's just kind of a fun example of how that visibility comes into play, I would say. I also wanted to just briefly address what Director Clapper said, not so much on the recruitment side, because I agree that that is a huge problem. I mean, we have to bring the numbers in order to optimize talent within the organization. But I will say, in terms of CIA, some of the things that were done was when we were selecting for assignments, so people are already in the building. So this isn't about recruitment necessarily, but on assignment selection, it really was trying to widen the pool as much as possible. So you really want to be broad about, here's an assignment, who should apply, and that gets to good managers encouraging people who otherwise might be reluctant to apply to that, so that you have a good pool of people to choose the talent from. And then think about that as a team dynamic. Who brings what to the table that's going to complement the chief role and the deputy role, for example. So I just wanted to make those brief comments. And then I did want to say from a personal standpoint, so like Kristen 30 some years ago, I often was the only woman in the room. I grew up in the Directorate of Operations, so, you know, heavy on male case officers at the time, definitely. I was not a case officer. I was something known as a collection management officer. And honestly, we tended to be female. So there was a little bit of, your gender was kind of defined by the role that you had, but that definitely changed over time. But I think I was somewhat ignorant, frankly, of gender challenges, challenges that maybe minorities felt. You know, it really didn't come to clear for me, honestly. I mean, I might have experienced some of these things. Like I do recall a boss telling me, great job, good girl, or, you know, having written in a performance evaluation once that, you know, I'm as good an officer as I am a new mother. Why does that relate? I don't know. But but I kind of took these things in stride and didn't really think about it. But it was when I was tapped on the shoulder and asked, we did this report on women in leadership. We want somebody to implement the recommendations. Would you do it? And I said, could I read the report first? And when I read the report and looked at the recommendations and looked at what the findings were, I saw myself in this. Oh my gosh, I struggled when I was part-time. I was part of a tandem couple. My husband had worked at the organization too, so we had to kind of, you know, balance out what that looks like. And frankly, my career, you know, got sidetracked. And so there were elements of that. Workplace flexibility was a big deal. And I looked at that report and I thought, wow, this really resonates with me. So I was pleased and happy to move forward in implementing recommendations around that report, because I personally could relate to so much of it. And one of the things, and this was Madeline Albright's guidance to the panel. Natalie, I don't know if this came about in any of your focus groups, but she really wanted to structure the report in a way that said, there are systemic barriers And in the case of the Women in Leadership report, of course, the focus was on women assuming greater instances of promotion, as well as positions of greater authority, commensurate with how they're represented in the workforce. So this isn't to give women more jobs or to give women, promote women for the sake of promoting women. But if women are represented about half of our workforce, why are they? I think that statistic is out there in the report, like 30% at the highest levels. Like, what gives? What's happening here? So the report did focus on systemic barriers, but there was also a self aspect to it. And I think it's important to recognize that we're all different people. We make personal choices, and that's okay. We just want people to be able to make informed personal choices, and we want managers to understand where people are in their lives and not necessarily be accepting of situations where women in particular tend to off ramp when they are at a certain point in their career because of childcare responsibilities or what have you, and just accept that. But to let people know these are the consequences, and then fine, you make kind of your choices as you want. And maybe it's the male partner in this maybe mother-father relationship who wants to off ramp at this time, and that's okay too. I actually remember a situation where I had a male employee who came to me and said, my wife's going to have a baby. I'd like to take 4 months off. And honestly, my reaction was, what? You're going to take 4 months off to take care of the baby? Inside my head, I don't think I vocalized that. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, this is a talented guy. He's worth keeping. And yes, of course, why not? You should be able to go on leave without pay for 4 months. But, kind of struck me the wrong way. And I must say, I had to kind of think about that, if you will. So I guess my conclusion on all of this is I really respect the fact that Director Brennan in particular, and it was his decision, made these reports public. I think that there has been an evolution for the good in terms of some of the things that were put in place as a result of these two reports and others. But I do think, and I know you're going to get to recommendations here, Michael, probably shortly, that came from your report, it's not a one and done, right? We can't just say, we've solved the issue, we're good. And there have been fits and starts. And I appreciate Natalie raising the, George Floyd and what's been happening in society, because I think that had a polarizing effect. And I think there is an element within the IC that says, I've had enough. I've had enough about this talk around diversity and inclusion. When are we going to end this? Well, we're going to end it the day that we don't need to really talk about it, frankly, when it becomes intertwined within the fabric of who we are, and it's second nature to do the things that we try to do. And I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, Lori. I agree, couldn't agree more that this is not a one and done. You read the report, therefore everything is great. No, absolutely not. One of the major trend lines from our findings is that this is a perpetual challenge. It's a consistent one. And I think the challenge for us is to indeed remain consistent, keep our eye on the ball from generation to generation. And I'd like to just talk for a few minutes about our recommendations on what might that be, what are some ideas for today and tomorrow for trying to build a better intelligence community for the United States, but also for the workforce. So we think the first step, and we talked about this a little bit regarding including contractors and metrics, and how do you really get an actual number that reflects who you are? Because if you don't know who you are, how can you possibly understand how to move forward? So that's sort of one of the big points we wanted to make. And if DEI is a mission imperative, we have to reflect diversity in the broadest context. So it might be worth thinking about setting goals and objectives that are perhaps beyond congressionally mandated targets. So not trying to simply hit what the law says, but go above and beyond if you can. I say that sitting in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I understand in implementation that can be hard, but nevertheless, if you set your goals high, which we should for the American intelligence community, then perhaps we will get to where we have to be. Transforming culture remains one of the hardest organizational elements to change. And we've heard some themes about that today with our panel. And indeed, we were reminded of that last week with someone visiting our team here at the Belfer Center. As we've seen in past cases of intelligence community reform, so thinking about 2005 or even going back to studies and reports on intelligence community reform in the 70s and the 50s, it requires often a generation of turnover. And that's disheartening on some level, but nevertheless, it means that you have to remain increasingly agile and push ahead. The positive note here, I think, and we've heard this today, we've seen this in our discussions, is that this is indeed a different era in 2022. We're not facing some of the same stigmas and challenges that we faced in the 1950s, but nevertheless, there are still many we have to overcome. So the next generation is indeed on the ascent, and I think they are very committed to diversity and inclusion on the whole, and that's good news. But now, how do we build on that? How do we build on generational dynamics by strengthening and amplifying positive trends that are underway within recruitment, mentorship, leadership across the community at every stage? Yes, absolutely the senior level, but also mid-level buy-in from department managers or leaders, and also at the lower levels as well. I won't dive too deep into this because the report provides a much greater depth of sort of how we see this going forward. But in essence, sort of the idea is that you need a cascading policy approach to this, because what you do first affects what you do next, and you can't always get to where next is unless you do the first thing. And for us, in our opinion, and I've seen this time and again with students and folks going into the IC, where you require a security clearance, you need a realistic timeline for 2022 and beyond. I've heard horror stories of taking 2 years, and I think that's very unrealistic. I understand there's been some progress in certain areas to lessen that time. I know Director Burns has prioritized it, getting it to as low as 6 months, but I don't see how you can recruit a workforce for the future when you're asking them to put their life on hold for as much as 2 years. It's simply unsustainable. So you have to at least start with security clearance reform, and you have to prioritize this in a significant way. After that, I think there's lots of ways where you can build a workforce culture for today and tomorrow. Educational opportunity and outreach, that has long been a mainstay of the IC. Perhaps it should be prioritized, and you should send folks and recruiters to institutions made up of teams that aren't just necessarily graduates of that institution, but a diverse team of folks that look and sound like what the actual goals are for the IC. Flexible work models, I think we've all learned a lot in the past couple of years about different ways you can work from home. Can you build regional SCIF facilities or places across the country to sort of provide a greater, some would say, quality of life and opportunity for living costs in schools and family? And are there ways you can do that? We think there are. Leadership, mentorship, and teamwork, absolutely essential. Again, at every level. Reverse mentoring is critical. So having someone of the next generation coming up through the ranks, they might have a different perspective than someone who has been in the organization for 30 years. So it's important to listen and take in those perspectives as part of the day-to-day. And then, of course, enduring mission narrative. I think reinforcing that at every moment that you can is pretty important. So people don't sign up for this type of work for the same reasons they might sign up for Apple or Google or Fortune 500 companies or financial firms on Wall Street. Typically, they sign up because they believe in the mission, and you have to continue that throughout careers. It can't just be, again, sign up on day one and that's it. You have to believe in it over the course of career. So they have to understand and they have to see that from the start, but also over the course of their career. So you have to reinforce the enduring mission narrative, I think is the big point. And finally, implementation. So the way we look at this is about constructive oversight, not destructive. Sometimes you hear on Congress or in reports in the news on these issues that oversight sort of offers this view that indeed it's confrontational, it's not constructive. I think in fact, most cases of intelligence reform throughout history, there were constructive elements at work that were able to get things done. So it has to be a consistent priority across both Congress and the executive branch. Retired intelligence professionals like folks on our panel today and academics can also amplify this through their engagement with the community and classes and coursework and teaching students. But synergy across the board, I think, can ultimately get us to where we need to be. So I'm going to just quickly with Lindsay talk about some of our key takeaways and key recommendations, and then we'll turn to our panel for sort of their concluding thoughts on the way ahead. So Lindsay, key takeaways.
Thank you, Michael. So throughout the report, we identified several things, several different aspects for insufficient progress over the years. That included, frequent leadership changes, which is normal in this space, but was definitely a contributing factor. Lack of middle management buy-in, poor metrics and absence of accountability, and a general cultural failure to embrace diversity is integral to IC mission success. They rather saw it as a political correctness. The second aspect was the fact that personnel numbers are classified still, and most, if not all, historical reports, not the most recent ones, as Laura mentioned, are still classified. This really makes it difficult for us to really assess what happened in the past to where we are today. While we know there's been significant progress, it's really hard for us to assess this from an open source perspective. And when we have a lack of transparency, it really fosters poor accountability. But we do see significant progress in that space, specifically over the last 5 to 10 years. And lastly, as we've mentioned several times, is that we believe that diversity statistics are actually far worse than they appear because of the lack of inclusion of contractors in the IC workforce, because they're not included, even though they are definitely an integral part of the community. Back to you, Michael.
Thanks, Lindsay. So what are some of our key recommendations? Big picture is to think about this as an intelligence professional, is that we use the cycle as a framework to continuously monitor and assess and act upon the requirement of building a diverse workforce. We need to transparently facilitate a whole of IC accounting, including both our organizations and public servants, but also contractors, to accurately measure and strengthen accountability. Leading culture change, as we talked about, requires cascading sequential actions to build cohesive momentum. I've heard a number of our panelists reflect on that today, is that, again, it's not one and done. You're making good progress, but you have to keep going. And to me, that's about momentum. And it includes steps like clearance reform, outreach, education, and especially retention. And finally, oversight with an engagement with Congress, perhaps the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, veterans, and scholars, in a constructive way that is not destructive. The intelligence community is the first line of defense of the American people. This is not a partisan issue. This is an American issue, and we need the best, most diverse, capable workforce we can build. And in my mind, that's sort of part of the way forward. And that's what we're thinking about in our report. So I do want to take a couple minutes here, though, to turn back to our panel and give them an opportunity to share some thoughts on what they think of as in the way ahead. What are they thinking about? Did any of these resonate with them? We'll start with Natalie.
Okay, great. So I'll just make a note that, it's not even been a year since I left the IC. And so for me, reading some of these recommendations and sort of the way forward ideas, I think really resonated in a positive way, which is to say that when I left, I feel like there was momentum, at least from where I sat in my office, in my directorate, to really make concrete improvements day to day for people who were there. This doesn't touch the recruitment piece, but in general, the point is, I think there is a lot of momentum. I think there is a current climate and demand for learning, for more conversation, for better understanding internally about how we are improving our diversity and inclusion day to day. And that, I think, is a really positive thing. And it really drove a lot of the work in my last 2 years there. And I was very impressed. It was some of the most meaningful work I did. And I was really impressed with just how much engagement you were getting from both the top levels in my structure, as well as, anywhere from junior to mid-grade officers who were saying, here's my idea, how can we implement this to make my work environment more inclusive, better. So I think that's one thing that I think really resonated for me. And so I think there's a positive environment here to take some of these ideas forward. I want to, though, focus on two kind of themes that came out in the paper's recommendation that resonated for me. And this is on the recruitment piece, but also on this cultural, this teamwork leadership piece. And it goes back to some of the points that both Kristen and Lori made about mentorship, sponsorship, et cetera. So on the recruitment piece, I won't claim to know the intricacies of how you can actually technically improve and speed up the recruitment process. But assuming the clearance process specifically, but assuming you could, I think in addition to getting those junior folks in at a faster rate and increasing the diversity of who you're bringing in, I think one interesting point in the paper's recommendations is, could this also actually facilitate an easier transition for mid-career hires who are already bringing in that difference of perspective and that experience to further shape and enhance the culture. And I think that's a really interesting potential positive externality of improving the clearance process. And the other thing, which is something I think about, is in addition to mid-career hires, could that actually facilitate an easier sort of revolving door for people, say like me, who've left the IC or the government, but haven't taken off the table that they want to go back. I'm still only halfway through my career and I had a great experience. I might want to go back into government or back into the IC, but depending on how much time you spend out, that can actually be harder than you think. And might fixing the clearance process facilitate that. Similarly, for women who take extended time off for family considerations, or anybody, it doesn't have to be a woman, might that also help that transition? So I think there's an interesting potential here where if you were to speed up the clearance process, could it actually bring in more than just that early phase recruitment, but actually keep more of a revolving door for people to bring in those changing perspectives. But the area in particular that I think has, a lot of room for impact and is in work, and this came up throughout all the panelists, is this idea of culture. It's the huge piece of this that takes the longest to change and is sometimes the hardest to change, but is so critical. And I want to make a point on the mentorship and sponsorship piece, and this came up from a few folks on the panel. So in my career, especially early in my career, I had the opportunity to serve on a working group that was really trying to create more awareness. It was basically an awareness campaign around sponsorship to educate, especially junior officers, how they could build their networks of mentors and potential sponsors, and why this is a good thing. Because it's when it is based on merit and when it is based on people scanning their workforce for talented people who need that extra help, whether it be because they're minorities or because they don't see their path themselves, to facilitate opportunities for them to demonstrate their skills. That is a really, really important piece of the progression of the career trajectory, and people feeling valued and feeling like they have a way to stay in this community and grow. And then the mentorship piece also, I think, is key, because I think this help is a key linking point towards people feeling like they have the support throughout their career to work through any challenges they're facing, or to feel like they have people who are behind them and pushing and advocating for them and helping them learn what it is they need to do to progress to the next phase. And on this piece, as an example, one of the pieces I'm most proud of in my last role was, and I think this helps everybody, including minorities and women, but just anyone, there was a gap in the analytic progression process where you got a lot of training at the beginning of your career, and then a burst of training when you changed into management or senior analysis track. But the in-between period, when you see a lot of attrition and when people are still working their way through the process and they're trying to imagine what their career looks like, there weren't a lot of touch points for understanding, how do I advance to the next level? How do I think about all those amazing career opportunities that are 5 years away? And so one of the things that I had the privilege to work on was really trying to hone in on this mentorship piece and creating a more structured touch point around training and investing in those mid-level officers to help them understand the progression and how they could kind of think about their next pathway. And so again, these kind of cultural norms, they take work and they take effort at all levels, but I think they can make a big difference in, particularly in the retention piece, for everyone, to include those who are underrepresented as you get further along in the leadership process. And the last thing I'll say on the cultural piece, this is very tactical, but I feel it's so important. And this has to do with the inclusivity piece, which is and this is also reflected in the report that the project just released, which is, amplifying voices in meetings. So these are just basic management best practices that I think, again, in the context of talking more about these issues, more and more people are becoming attuned to why this matters and how they can do it better. And this is the anecdote I'll give you is I worked with a colleague. We were peers. I was not her manager at the time. And I noticed she was a female minority officer, and she rarely spoke up in meetings. And I remember noticing this, and I asked her outside of the meeting one day, I was like, I noticed you don't ever speak up. Like, is there a reason? What have you? It turns out she was an introvert, and she said, I can't process all of the things that are happening in the meeting in order to construct my thoughts in the moment. So therefore I don't say anything. And just knowing this, I think helped later when I was actually managing people, that there are people like that they're quiet for those reasons, or that they're not being given an opportunity, or they're not feeling like there's a space for them to speak up. And I think it changed the way I tried to amplify people in my own meetings. So this is one person with one team, but if you expand that and think of all the teams in the agency doing that exact type of work to amplify voices in their little sphere, I think it can do a lot to change the culture of people feeling included. And once you do that, all of their good ideas, all of what they can bring, as Jeff was saying, bring their whole selves to work. I think this is a piece of that process. And that culture it takes work, it's every day, can be small steps, but they're very meaningful. And so I think that culture piece to me really resonated as an area where there is work being done, and there's always more to be done, but it's so impactful. So I'll stop there.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Natalie. I couldn't agree more that it needs to be a continuous, but one hopes, and I think we are seeing it, is that over time, the small things add up, and you start to see the culture shift in a positive way. Kristen.
Thanks, Michael. So I just want to pick up on a couple of themes we've talked about and maybe touch on one we haven't yet. So on transparency, I would love for a follow-on to include current serving leaders at DNI and the IC entities. And I think you would be able to have that happen, because this is top of mind for Director Haynes and Director Burns and Director Austin and so many others. And so there has been a lot of progress, and I think Natalie notes some of it. I would imagine talking about it, bragging about it, talking about the progress would be, a welcome opportunity. And it's not just about doing the right thing, as we've said here. It's about accomplishing the mission. I mean, fundamentally, Jeff had some great examples about that. But, I remember there was someone on my team, and I had a big team at one point, and they said, well, how could you have so-and-so and so-and-so sitting side by side? And I said, what do you mean? So, well, he's Indian and she's Pakistani. I'm like, why does it matter? They're fabulous as a team because they do X, Y, and Z. So I just think it's the more mission focused and people see it as accomplishing the mission, the more buy-in it gets. And what we've talking about, and I think I've been talking more about evolution, and others have been talking more about transformation. And your paper talks about transformation. And it requiring generational turnover. And part of the challenge is our younger generation doesn't stay as long. And the folks who are there year after year are, in many cases, those who've been there like us, 20 or 30 years. I think Sue Gordon has talked about this a lot. And one of the things she says about almost any topic is focus on where you want to be and the benchmarks to get there, not about what's the next step, what's the next step, what a next step. So where do you want to be, that transformative place? And inevitably, the steps to get there are there. And I think some of that thinking becomes really important, both for outside and inside. Totally agree with you about counting contractors. There's a real focus on blue versus green. And sometimes contractors feel like second-class citizens because they aren't government employees. And, this is another way in which that's actually validated, because they don't count in this way. So it seems unnecessary to me. Clearance reform, and I want to take a little bit of a different take on that. We also have to look, does everyone need one? In the world that we lived in, that used to be true because most information was collected via national technical means that require, so that's signals intelligence or human information or, other kinds of information. But now, with the fourth industrial revolution, so the Internet of Things and the interconnectivity of millions and billions of devices, commercial data, in addition to open source data, is growing exponentially and will absolutely outpace what's collected via national technical means if it hasn't already. And we're only at the beginning of that story. And so I think you can have intelligence officers doing things. Think about Bellingcat, right? This dispersed network of journalists who have access to open source information and commercial information, and they have broken transformative stories that, you know, those of us in the intelligence community recognize as groundbreaking. More of that is going to be happening, and that absolutely needs to be an area of focus. Is maybe not everybody needs a clearance, and there's a huge section of work that can be done with that. And I think the other thing is, this isn't just true in the intelligence community. This is true in the private sector too. I was in a board meeting recently and someone said, well, isn't it weird for you to be the only woman in the room? And I hadn't even noticed. That's just the way it has always been. And in the private sector, I would say there's actually more advances that I've seen in government that I currently see in some big corporations. It's almost all male-led, white male-led, and then in the boardroom, there's very little diversity. And I know that's a different subject, but I just would point out that this is the society in which we live in. And so I just want to have one piece of advice, and it's building a little bit on what Jeff said, is be your authentic self. Don't conform. I absolutely conformed. Those big suits were a terrible choice, right? And I think a lot of us had tried to fit into that model of what's acceptable. Absolutely don't conform. Make them make room for you. That diversity, what you will bring new to the mission, that is something that will really help support it going forward. So I just want to say just a quick thank you for letting me participate today, and I will stop talking.
Well, thank you so much, Kristen. Just a really, really good point to end on. And I couldn't agree more. The way I try to think about it is, you're trying to find the best and the brightest to come work for you. So you should make the space that they want to work in. Jeff.
Second, the classification and background. Big fan of exploring that. Also, I think we should even have a like a West Coast hub, kind of like maybe a mini Liberty Crossing out here, right? Like this, where I am, the fight that I'm in, this is ground zero for like whether two of our top adversaries will achieve military supremacy, right? So like, why not have operationally, right, folks who can deal with that, but also in terms of creating access and exposure for different part of the country, right? There's a proportion, right, or a very tight correlation between the density of folks who go into the intelligence community who are proximal to DC, right? Like, no brainer, right? So like, all right, would we want to be proximate to the talent and the brains that are, here in the West Coast, particularly in Northern California? So like, if anyone has any ideas on how to petition the leadership or the administration, whoever, to consider, having a Liberty Crossing light on the West Coast, hit me up. I would love to explore that. But yeah, I think, so one of the things I would say is, it's not also important that what we do, it's important how we say it. It's important the words we use when we talk about diversity, right? Let's not fool ourselves. When you have the Secretary Pompeo say that multiculturalism is un-American, it's not what we do. That has real impact. Obviously, the previous president, doing away with DEI initiatives, and let's be real, we know that there's this undercurrent of white nationalism that appears to be growing. Unfortunately, I think it's more people just feeling safer to be open about what their viewpoints are. But also in general society, right? A friend of mine just sent me a message. There's, I think, about 450 challenges to Title IX. And the Department of Education is actually considering it, in one school here in California has actually removed scholarships for women because of a challenge to Title IX. So like there is this which typically happens when you have these progressions, right? When you look back over the arc of history, where you have this reaction, this vehement reaction to progress. But it's, we got to be real that does exist, and and don't want to say that, yeah, we're making great strides, but we're making great strides but there's also this issue that we need to deal with. But when I say it's important how we speak about diversity, I know this is not politically correct to say, but like all white heterosexual men are not evil, right? Like I've had a lot of really great white allies in my career. And a lot of times the way we speak about things, it makes folks feel like they don't have a place in the fight. We need everybody in this fight. In order for us to do this, we need everybody to get off the bench. We need everybody to come out of the stands. We need everybody on the field. And so I know people say, well, we don't need to be worried about making people feel comfortable or whatever. And like, I get that perspective, but in order for us, if that's what it takes to get everybody engaged, then that's what we need to do. And, you know, again, to kind of draw a tactical or operational analogy, you know, like if anyone's ever been out on a patrol or, you know, as an embed or whatever, if you've been somewhere where you're out, you're in a, you know, in a particularly dangerous place and you're on patrol, if the most junior soldier or most junior analyst or the person who doesn't even have a gun says, hey, stop, I hear something or I see something. If you were the full bird colonel or a 4-star, they're not going to say, well, wait a minute, you've only got a year on this team, or you're an analyst, you don't even know how to use a weapon. We're not going to listen to you. No, everybody stops and shuts up. It's like, all right, what do you see? What's going on, right? And that's how serious and how integral everyone's perspective and everyone's ability to contribute should be to our diversity question and our diversity challenge, is that every single person's ground truth is valuable, and we need every single person's ground truth to inform how we discuss diversity, but in addition to how the things in the policy that we actually look to implement. But I think we have to be very smart and deliberate about how we speak about diversity, because it isn't just black and white, it's veteran status, it's handicap, it's does the most junior person on your team feel empowered to speak up when they're the lone voice that's counter to the other voices in the room? So, you know, the new term, you know, neurodiversity, right? Like, we really need to be deliberate when we speak about what we're talking about, because I welcome anyone's debate about why we as a nation, counter to what some in Congress are even saying and what Secretary Pompeo said, where we are not more successful having a representation and equity in our ranks. I welcome that argument, right? So I think we need to be very careful, or not careful, but just deliberate about how we speak about diversity, that it's not this thing that when people hear that, they're like, oh, here we go, it's like all kumbaya, whatever, you know, like we yes, of course, there's a value and a moral argument to that. But again, also too, like, we need to really drive home the fact that diversity is as important as the technology, the bullets, the bombs, procurement. It is that important. And I still feel like it's kind of like, well, we'll take care of all this stuff and then we'll deal with it. Like, no, like, stop. This has to be, and we have to commit ourselves as fervently to this as we do to hypersonics, to satellite development, to like it needs to be that important to the way we conduct business. And I love Lori's point. People say, well, when are we gonna stop talking about it? Well, when it's no longer a problem, right? Like, I'm sorry that you're threatened by the notion that everybody in the team feels seen and feels heard and feels like a valued member. I'm sorry that gets on your nerves, right? Well, how about you get off your butt and help us fix it so that you don't have to hear it anymore, right? So I definitely think we need to change the way we talk about it, and take some of the narrative back in terms of what we mean when we speak about diversity within the intelligence profession.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. I couldn't agree more. And just to amplify a couple points that you made, part of the way I've always tried to think about it, and hopefully this message resonates or continues to resonate more with folks who might feel threatened or might feel like they're not part of whatever this is. Diversity is inclusive, it's not exclusive, and that includes everyone. And like you say, we're not going to get to where we need to be unless we have a strong team. And that's what we need to do. And I couldn't agree with you more that we got to make sure everyone is on that team. Lori, over to you.
I'm just going to make a few final points because everybody's so eloquently touched on so many different issues, including the themes that came out of your report and the recommendations. So I do think one of the big things is just making people smarter about all these issues. And I'll give you a concrete example. I have a colleague, a male colleague, and when this concept of sponsorship came up out of the Women in Leadership report, and of course we've heard about sponsorship and everything, he would say, I don't know about that sponsorship thing. That just doesn't seem right. People should really be seen based on merit. And in the next breath, he would say, oh, so-and-so's coming over to my office who actually happened to be a minority or happened to be not a minority or happened to be a woman or male. So-and-so's coming over to my office and I'm going to talk a little bit about career advancement. And you know what? I'm going to put her name in the hat for this position because I think she'd really be good for it, type of thing. And I would say that's sponsorship. So this whole idea of really raising the level of awareness of people. I used to tell people, if nothing else, if you don't believe that this report about women applies to you or this report about diversity applies to you, read the report and at least be smart about it. And then the final comment I will make is people at the end of the day, from a very practical standpoint, they need to see tangibility. They need to see themselves in it, no matter what perch they happen to be. So I know what some of the things we would do is we would think about, if you're an individual, what are some things you can do? Like we actually gave people ideas. If you're a manager, what are some things you can do? If you're a leader, what are some things you can do? So with that said, I'm going to give everybody a challenge right here on this call, and that is this. For the next month, I would like you to write down examples of diversity and inclusion in action that you personally observe within your own orbit, and see what that looks like at the end of a month. See what those examples, because people have to see it, and it's really hard. As I said at the beginning of this call, language, culture, particularly in this space, we get that. But what are some other examples of your superpower that really, and what has that superpower done? That's something that we all need to be more aware of, I would say. I'll stop there.
Well, that's a fantastic way to end on, and as a professor who appreciates assigning homework to everyone, thank you very much, Lori. And I agree with you 100% that it's important to stop and think about, where is this in my day-to-day? How is it real? And that will help empower understanding, absolutely. Everyone, we've actually just about hit 2 hours. It flew by for me. I was learning every step of the way, and I appreciate the time and the insight and wisdom from all of our panelists joining us today to help unpack diversity, equity, and inclusion, past, present, and future in the American intelligence community. So I just want to thank Natalie, Kristen, Jeff, and Lori for joining us with their time. Lindsay, too, of course, thanks for joining us. And I want to wish everyone a great rest of your day, evening, or morning, wherever you are in the world. Again, make sure to check out the report. It's posted on the Belfer Center website. And if you have any thoughts on it, you should be able to find my email there too. So thanks again, everybody. Take the best of care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.